My name is Charlotte. I'm 30 years old. That day was supposed to be the happiest of my life, but it turned out quite differently. My husband Jason hit me on our wedding day because I didn't give up my chair to his mother Barbara. At that time, I didn't know that this day would change my entire life. Guests were laughing and having fun, music was playing, waiters were serving dishes. I had just sat down in my chair after a long dance when I suddenly heard Jason's cold voice. "Stand up. Give your seat to Mom," he said without a hint of doubt in his voice. I froze, not even realizing what was happening. Barbara stood nearby, saying nothing, just looking at me expectantly. I slowly raised my eyes to Jason, trying to understand if he was serious. But he didn't wait for my answer. His palm crashed into my face with such force that I almost fell off the chair. The entire hall froze for a second. Shock hung in the air like a heavy cloud. And then, someone's nervous laughter rang out. Someone clapped. Someone looked away. My face was burning from the slap, but even more from humiliation. I looked at Jason and couldn't believe what had happened. Is this the same person who vowed to love and protect me forever? The same person who had put a ring on my finger just a few hours ago? He didn't even look embarrassed, just continued eating as if nothing had happened. Barbara smiled and calmly took my place, as if everything was going according to plan. I remained standing among the guests, feeling small and helpless. One thought was spinning in my head. If he did this today, what would happen next? I wanted to say something, but the words got stuck in my throat. And then something happened that no one expected. One of the guests suddenly rose from his seat. It was a family friend, Michael, a tall man with a piercing gaze. He came up to me, put his hand on my shoulder, and quietly asked, "Are you okay?" I couldn't answer, just nodded, although everything inside was screaming, "No!" Jason cast a quick, displeased glance at us, but said nothing. Barbara continued to eat calmly as if nothing was happening. Music started playing in the hall again. People tried to return to the festivities, but the tension didn't dissipate. I felt gazes on me, curious, condemning, sympathetic. Michael carefully led me to another chair, away from Jason and Barbara. "Sit down," he said softly. I sat next to him, looking at my hands clenched into fists. I wanted to wake up and realize that this was just a terrible dream. But this was reality. My reality right on my wedding day. Jason finally got up and approached me. His face was gloomy and cold. "Why are you making a scene?" he hissed, leaning closer. I didn't answer, just looked into his eyes. There wasn't a drop of regret in them. Only irritation. Michael intervened, his voice calm but firm. "Don't you dare raise your voice at her." Jason straightened up, looked at him, then at me. His fingers clenched into fists, but he didn't strike again. Barbara continued eating as if nothing was happening. The guests started whispering again. Someone discreetly took out their phone, filming what was happening. I felt something breaking inside me, and at the same time, a new, strange sensation was born. For the first time all evening, I wanted to stand up and leave right now, to abandon everything without looking back. But before I could take even a step, something even more unexpected happened. Barbara abruptly put her glass on the table, stood up, and looked at me coldly. "Are you still here?" Her voice sounded calm, but there was a hidden threat in it. I looked at her, at Jason, at the guests who had quieted down in anticipation. Something inside me snapped. The fear disappeared. The confusion disappeared. Only a strange clarity remained. I stood up, straightened my back, looked directly at Barbara. "Yes, I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere," I said evenly. Jason frowned. Surprise flashed in his eyes. Barbara narrowed her eyes. Her fingers nervously gripped the edge of the tablecloth. "You're disgracing my family," she hissed quietly, but so that I heard every word. I felt my breath catch in my chest. "Family?" I repeated, smiling bitterly. I looked at Jason, who stood next to her, silent, firm, confident that he was right. I looked at the guests. Many averted their gaze. Some looked embarrassed, but no one intervened. Michael quietly rose from his seat, came closer, but didn't say anything. He was just nearby, and that was enough. I breathed deeper and heard my voice. It was firm and unexpectedly calm. "This is not my family," I whispered and turned to leave. But Jason grabbed my wrist. His grip was strong. His fingers dug into my skin. "You can't just leave," he said threateningly quietly. The guests held their breath. The waiters froze. I felt a storm rising in my chest, but this time it wasn't fear. It was something else. Hot, bright, alive. I looked at his hand, at my hand, then back at him, and slowly but firmly said, "Let me go." But he only tightened his fingers. And then something happened that no one expected. Someone's hand sharply grabbed Jason's shoulder and yanked him back. He lost his balance, let go of me, and staggering, took a step back. A gasp of surprise rang out in the hall. Someone cried out. I turned and saw that it was Michael. His face remained calm, but anger flashed in his eyes. "Don't touch her," he said firmly. Jason straightened up, his face distorted with anger. "Don't interfere in our affairs," he said through clenched teeth. But Michael only stepped forward, blocking his path to me. "You've already made one mistake. Don't make a second one." At that moment, I saw for the first time that something like doubt flashed in Jason's eyes. But it lasted only a second. Then he became the same again. Harsh, cold. Barbara jumped up from her seat, her lips pressed into a thin line. "How dare you raise your hand against my son?" she shouted. Michael turned to her, his gaze heavy and merciless. "And how dare he raise his hand against his wife?" His voice sounded loud and clear. The hall froze again. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Barbara turned pale but quickly regained her composure. "It's none of your business." Her voice trembled with fury. But then there was another movement next to me. I saw several guests stand up from their seats. They looked at me, then at Jason. Their faces were serious. I suddenly realized that I wasn't alone. All this time I had felt small, lonely, helpless. But that wasn't true. People saw. They understood. They were silent, but now they no longer wanted to be silent. Someone said, "She needs to leave here." Someone else nodded. "I'll help her." Jason stepped towards me again, his eyes flashing with anger, but now he wasn't so confident. I felt someone gently take my hand. "You're safe," a voice whispered next to me. And then I realized that this moment would change everything forever. I looked at the people around, at their faces full of anxiety and determination. It felt like the whole world was swaying under my feet, but the hand holding mine was warm and firm. "You're not leaving," Jason hissed, but his voice no longer sounded as confident as before. Michael stood between us again. His figure seemed tall and unwavering. "She will leave." His voice was even, but there was a threat in it. Jason clenched his fists, his gaze darting from me to the people around. Barbara grabbed his arm and squeezed her fingers. I saw her lips moving silently. "Don't do this," I read in their movement, but he was already too far to back down. I pulled my hand out of the stranger's palm, took a step forward, raised my head, and for the first time all evening looked directly into Jason's eyes. "No more," I said quietly but distinctly. He froze. "Never again," I repeated. My voice was calm, but a hurricane was raging inside. I saw a shadow of doubt run across his face, and suddenly something broke in him. He stepped back, then again. His breathing became heavy, his lips pressed into a narrow line. "I didn't expect this." His voice sounded so quiet that it was barely audible. I nodded and turned to leave, but before I took even one step, something even stranger happened. The doors of the hall burst open with a loud thud. A tall man in a dark suit entered the room. His face was serious and impenetrable. Two more followed him. Their gazes immediately stopped on Jason. I froze, not understanding what was happening. It became quiet again around, tension hung in the air. Someone from the guests quickly whispered, "Who is this? Who called them?" Jason also froze. His fingers twitched, but he didn't say a word. The man in the suit stepped forward and extended his hand, pointing at Jason. "You'll have to come with us." His voice was low and confident. Jason jerked back, his gaze darting from them to me, to Barbara. "What does this mean?" she asked. Her voice trembled, but she tried to hold herself together. Jason opened his mouth, wanted to say something, but changed his mind. In the crowd, someone quietly gasped. Someone grabbed their phone to film what was happening. I suddenly realized that I didn't know who these people were, but judging by the expressions on the faces of those around, they looked like those who shouldn't be contradicted. Michael, who had been standing next to me all this time, put his hand on my shoulder. "You're free now," he said quietly. "Free," I repeated. Everything inside me was contracting and straightening out. Two men took Jason by the arms and led him to the exit. I stood still, not knowing what to feel, what to do, what to say. But before he disappeared from the hall, I heard his voice. "This isn't over yet," he said slowly. And then I realized that he was right. His words echoed in my mind, even when the doors slammed shut behind him. The hall remained tense. The silence stretched like a heavy burden. Barbara stood in place, her fingers still gripping the edge of the tablecloth. Her face had turned ashen pale. I saw how she was frantically trying to comprehend what was happening. Her lips were moving, but there were no sounds. Guests were looking at each other, some quietly whispering. Michael carefully pulled me towards the exit. "Let's go," he said softly. I nodded, feeling my legs barely holding me. But before we could move, Barbara suddenly raised her head sharply. Her eyes flashed with anger. Her fingers were trembling, and she forcefully hit the table. "You've ruined everything," she hissed. I froze, meeting her gaze. "You think you've won?" she continued, stepping closer to me. I looked at her, but there was no fear inside me anymore. She was trembling with anger, her hands clenched into fists. "My son was right. You should have given in. You should have obeyed." I heard not only fury in her voice, but also something like desperation. But why? Why did this chair have such huge importance for her? I suddenly realized that it wasn't about the chair at all. Not about it. It was about power, about submission, about showing one's place in their family. I no longer belonged to this family, and she knew it. But before I could say a word, something unexpected happened. Barbara suddenly grabbed a glass from the table and threw it on the floor with all her might. The glass shattered into hundreds of pieces. A ringing crash echoed through the hall. Guests gasped, someone cried out, someone fearfully moved back. I remained standing in place, feeling my heart pounding wildly in my chest. "You've destroyed my family!" she screamed. Her voice trembled with anger. Her eyes were darting around, her hands clenching and unclenching. She looked as if she was about to pounce on me, but I didn't look away. I wasn't afraid anymore. "You were never my family," I said evenly. Her face contorted with fury. She took a step towards me, but suddenly someone grabbed her by the shoulders. It was the guests. 2 men stopped her before she could come closer. "Let me go!" she gasped. Her body was trembling, but her voice no longer sounded as confident as before. They didn't let her go, held her firmly but carefully so as not to harm her. Michael leaned towards me. His voice was almost a whisper, but firm. "It's time to leave." I nodded, taking a step back. But at that moment, Barbara spoke again. Her voice became low and ominous. "You think this is the end? But you're wrong." I felt a cold shiver run down my skin, but I didn't let myself flinch. I just turned and walked towards the exit. Behind me, I could hear whispers, indignant voices, the sound of glass crunching under someone's steps. The world around seemed hazy, but with each step I felt my breathing becoming more even. I did it. I got out of this hell. But for some reason, deep down inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that it really wasn't over yet. I left the hall. The cool night air hit my face. I breathed deeper, but strangely, the tension didn't disappear. The guests remained inside, but I could feel their gazes even through the walls. Michael walked beside me, silently, not asking questions. We stopped at the doors. I looked at the dark sky above. The stars were twinkling, but their light seemed distant and cold. "What now?" he asked quietly. I didn't know what to answer. Everything happened so quickly, and now emptiness had set in. All my life I had imagined my wedding differently. But here I was, standing in a torn dress, with a bitter taste in my soul and without a husband. I closed my eyes, trying to gather my thoughts. "I have to leave," I said finally. Michael nodded, but before he could say anything, I heard movement behind me. I turned around. Barbara was standing at the doors. Her face remained dark and tense, but now there wasn't only anger in her eyes. There was something else there, something cold and calculating. Michael took a step forward, but I raised my hand, stopping him. Barbara tilted her head slightly to the side. Her voice became even quieter. "You have no idea what you've just gotten yourself into." She turned and left, leaving only a cold emptiness behind. I stood silently, feeling anxiety growing inside me. But before I could say anything, a phone rang from the darkness. The sharp sound made me flinch. I slowly took it out of my purse. The screen displayed unknown number. I hesitated, but pressed answer anyway. For several seconds, only breathing could be heard on the other end of the line, and then a voice that I didn't expect to hear at all came through. A muffled, low voice cut through the silence. "You've made a big mistake." I froze, clutching the phone. My fingers turned white, but I didn't remove it from my ear. "Who is this?" I asked, although somewhere deep down I already knew the answer. Silence reigned on the other end, but the breathing could still be heard, even cold. Then the voice sounded again, slowly, clearly. "You think you've left, but you've just opened another door." A chill ran down my spine. I stepped back. My back hit Michael's solid shoulder. He immediately noticed that something was wrong with me, tensed up. "Who is it?" he asked quietly, but I couldn't answer. I heard the voice in the receiver again, but now it was even quieter, almost a whisper. "Soon you'll understand what I mean." The connection was cut off. Short beeps filled the night silence. I slowly lowered my hand. My heart was beating in my chest like a drum. Michael gently touched my shoulder. His voice became firm. "What's happening?" I raised my gaze to him. He looked concerned, but not scared. I knew I should tell him, but the words got stuck in my throat. Everything was too strange, too unexpected. But before I could explain what had happened, we heard the sound of approaching footsteps. I turned and saw a dark figure approaching us from the shadows. The steps were slow and confident. Each strike of shoes on the ground echoed in the night. Michael straightened up, his body tensed. He covered me with himself. The figure stopped just a few steps away from us. I squinted, trying to make out the face, but in the darkness it remained unclear. Then the person spoke, and this voice made me go cold. I froze. The air became thick and heavy. I looked at the shadow in front of me, my heart wildly pounding in my chest. Michael slowly moved forward, but I touched his arm, stopping him. I knew this voice. Quiet, cold, imbued with a strange smirk. The figure took another step, and finally the moonlight illuminated the face. I gasped, feeling the cold run through my skin. In front of me stood a person whom I had long buried in my memory, my ex-fiancé Alex, the one I once loved and who destroyed my faith in love. "Are you surprised?" His lips touched a smirk, but in his eyes there was only harshness. "How are you here?" My voice was hoarse. I barely swallowed the lump that had risen to my throat. He slowly looked me up and down. Something dark flashed in his gaze. "I warned you." He tilted his head slightly to the side, studying my reaction. "You chose the wrong path." At that moment, everything fell into place. I remembered Barbara, her cold, calculating gaze, her threats. I remembered the voice on the phone, the breathing interrupting the silence. Everything was connected. My ex-fiancé, Jason, their family. I had fallen into a trap whose existence I didn't even suspect. But I wasn't the girl who used to succumb to someone else's power anymore. I took a deep breath, straightened up, stepped forward. "You dare not scare me," I said firmly. I saw his smile falter, but he quickly regained his composure. "We'll see," he replied. Michael put his hand on my shoulder. I felt his support, his determination. We didn't move from the spot, didn't take a step back. In the distance, the sound of a siren was heard. Someone's car was approaching. Alex frowned, the corners of his lips trembling. He knew his time was running out. The night was cold, full of secrets and unspoken words. But I knew one thing. I'm not afraid anymore. He took one last look, full of promises, and then turned and disappeared into the darkness. I exhaled, feeling the world becoming clear again. Michael gently squeezed my shoulder. His voice was soft but confident. "You're really free now." I nodded, allowing this truth to settle inside. I had made my choice, and this time it was the right one. Ahead was uncertainty, possibly even danger. But I knew I wasn't alone anymore, and this gave me the strength to face everything that lies ahead. 5 years have passed since that day that was supposed to be the happiest of my life, but instead turned it upside down. I often remember that evening, the sound of broken glass, Barbara's cold eyes, Alex's threatening whisper on the phone. But now these memories no longer evoke the same fear. After that night, I really left. Michael helped me pack my things and drove me to a small coastal town where he had an old house. For the first few weeks, I was just recovering, trying to comprehend what had happened. Michael was nearby, not pushing, just supporting with his presence. Gradually, I started a new life. I got a job at the local library, made new friends. Sometimes at night I was still haunted by nightmares, but with each day they became less frequent. Jason tried to contact me several times, but I didn't answer. The divorce went quickly and without unnecessary problems. Apparently, he also wanted to close this chapter as soon as possible. I heard nothing about Barbara and Alex, although sometimes I caught myself thinking that I expected to see their shadows around the corner. Michael became my best friend. His support and belief in me helped me regain confidence in myself. Gradually, our friendship grew into something more, although we were both afraid to admit it even to ourselves. And now, 5 years later, I'm standing in a wedding dress again. But this time, everything is different. I look in the mirror and see a strong woman who has been through hell and survived, who has learned to trust and love again. Michael is waiting for me at the altar. I know he will never raise his hand against me, never try to break my spirit. Our love grew out of respect and mutual support. As I walk down the aisle, I see the faces of friends and relatives. They are smiling, and there isn't a drop of doubt or condemnation in their eyes. They know our story and are proud of how far we've come. As I pronounce my vows, I feel tears welling up in my eyes, but these are tears of happiness and gratitude, for a second chance, for a new life, for true love. I know that the past will always be a part of me. It made me stronger, taught me to value the present and fight for my happiness. But now I look to the future with hope and confidence. When Michael and I leave the church under a rain of rose petals, I feel something new and beautiful blossoming inside. I am free. I am loved. I am happy. And even though life won't always be easy, I know that I can handle everything it throws at me, because now I have a real family and real love, and that is the greatest miracle of all. Did you like the story? Write your opinion in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next interesting story. See you tomorrow.